I had the power to destroy anyone, but not her. Not the woman who sang the song my mother used to hum before she died. If you believe love can break even the darkest heart, then hit that subscribe button, because this story will make you feel everything. Are you ready to see how a heart forged in fire and blood can still melt? Hit that subscribe button right now. Don't just watch this story, commit to it. I promise you, what I reveal next will change everything you thought you knew about control, power, and the women who wield it. Subscribe now, because once you hear this melody, there's no turning back. The city of New York never slept, and that was just the way I preferred it. The grinding machinery of the night was the engine of my world. I was Alessandro Moretti, Il Lupo, the wolf, and I was accustomed to seeing the world from above, usually from the soundproof solitude of my penthouse. But tonight, I needed to feel the pavement vibrating beneath my feet, the faint hum of my empire in motion. I chose the Whisper Lounge in Little Italy. It wasn't a place of grand meetings. It was an old haunt, one of the first buildings my father secured. I sat in a secluded booth, shrouded in shadow, the scent of espresso and old leather thick in the air. Two of my most trusted shadows, Enzo and Sal, were positioned around me, their presence a silent, lethal warning to anyone who dared approach. Control was my oxygen, and fear was the air everyone else breathed around me. I hadn't expected tonight to be anything more than a routine check-in with the past. I was savoring a glass of Nobile di Montepulciano, a wine I kept here strictly for my own indulgence, when the noise died. Not the sound of the pianist, which continued its smooth, irrelevant melody, but the noise inside my head. The perpetual calculation, the constant watchfulness, it all just ceased. I heard her. She was a waitress, clearing a nearby table. Her back was mostly to me, her movements practiced and tired. She was humming. It was quiet, an almost subconscious sound, but to me it was a siren call from a past I had successfully buried under 2 decades of ambition and brutality. The melody. It was the same lullaby my late mother, Isabella, used to sing to me when I was a child hiding from the dark. It was a tune I thought was extinct, scrubbed from the earth when the fire consumed my family's house and took her with it. My mind, usually a fortress of cold, strategic thought, was instantly overrun by sensory ghosts. The smell of her lavender soap, the whisper of her Italian, the rough wool of the blanket she used to tuck around me. I gripped the glass so tightly I felt the strain in my knuckles. That song, it wasn't just a lullaby, it was the soundtrack to the last moments of my innocence. It was what she hummed to drown out the sound of the men arguing downstairs, the sound of the life she knew was coming for me. The woman straightened, and the humming stopped. The abrupt silence was deafening. I felt a chill, a deep, visceral disturbance. Enzo shot me a sharp look, immediately sensing the shift in my posture, the sudden, unnatural stillness of the wolf when he should be feeding. I could feel his concern, but I couldn't communicate with him. I was trapped inside that song. I set the glass down with a heavy, final clink. The sound resonated through the booth, drawing every eye in my vicinity. I pushed myself to my feet. The movement was slow, deliberate, a predator rising. I walked toward the corner table. My footsteps were silent on the thick carpet, but my intent was loud. The woman, a young woman with tired eyes and dark, practical hair, jumped slightly as I approached. It was a small movement, a weariness more than fear, as if she knew the universe had just decided to complicate her life with the appearance of its darkest patron. "Signor Moretti," she managed, her voice respectful but flat. "Is everything all right? Can I get you another wine?" I ignored the protocol. I ignored the public setting. I ignored the fact that my entire security detail was suddenly on high alert, scanning the room for a non-existent threat. The threat wasn't outside. It was in the melody she had just exhaled. "The song," I said, and my voice sounded rougher than usual, as if scraped from the bottom of a dry well. "The one you were just humming." She blinked, her dark hazel eyes wide. She looked momentarily confused, as if she hadn't even realized she was singing aloud. This was her truth. It was a part of her, not a performance. I don't know the name of it, Signor," she answered, her arms shaking just enough for me to notice. I leaned in, dominating her space, letting her feel the full, dangerous force of my focused attention. "I didn't ask you the name," I corrected, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper only she could hear. "I asked you where you learned it." The fear finally registered, replacing the weariness in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of a customer, but the fear of a woman confronted by pure, uncontrolled power. Yet she held her ground. She didn't drop her eyes or flinch back. She took a steadying breath. "My mother," she finally said, her voice a fragile wisp that still held absolute conviction. "My mother used to sing it, every night. She was the one who taught me." My mother used to sing it too. The words were not a coincidence. They were a thunderbolt of fate. It was impossible. That song was buried with my past, a relic of a life unconnected to hers. Yet here she stood, a stranger, a simple waitress, sharing the deepest, most sacred piece of my broken history. The sheer force of the synchronicity overwhelmed me. It was not just a song. It was a cosmic thread pulling me back to the man I used to be. I wanted to grab her and demand every detail of her mother, her life, her connection to my own tragic history. But I didn't. I simply stared, the wolf momentarily stunned by the scent of lavender and the echo of a forgotten lullaby. I let her go, watching as she retreated, carrying the memory of my mother and the crushing weight of my sudden, dangerous attention. "I didn't ask you the name," I corrected, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper only she could hear. "I asked you where you learned it." The fear finally registered, replacing the weariness in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of a customer, but the fear of a woman confronted by pure, uncontrolled power. Yet she held her ground. She didn't drop her eyes or flinch back. She took a steadying breath. "My mother used to sing it every night. She was the one who taught me." My mother used to sing it too. The words were not a coincidence. They were a thunderbolt of fate. It was impossible. That song was buried with my past, a relic of a life unconnected to hers. Yet here she stood, a stranger, a simple waitress, sharing the deepest, most sacred piece of my broken history. The sheer force of the synchronicity overwhelmed me. It was not just a song. It was a cosmic thread pulling me back to the man I used to be. I wanted to grab her and demand every detail of her mother, her life, her connection to my own tragic history. But I didn't. I simply stared, the wolf momentarily stunned by the scent of lavender and the echo of a forgotten lullaby. I let her go, watching as she retreated, carrying the memory of my mother and the crushing weight of my sudden, dangerous attention. I walked back to my booth, the expensive wine suddenly tasteless. I had come looking for control. I found a wound ripped wide open. I didn't care about a rival family's movements or a police investigation anymore. I only cared about Elena Rossi and the song she carried in her throat. The hunt had begun, and the prey was the truth about my own heart. I had my people move fast, but subtly. I needed information, not disruption. Her name, Elena Rossi, was the only fact I needed to anchor my obsession. The dossier I received was thin,
She was 25, lived in a dreary walk-up in the Lower East Side, and worked 2 jobs, one here at the Whisper Lounge and another doing catering downtown. The report detailed nothing extraordinary, nothing that explained the powerful spiritual connection I felt. She was just a woman swimming upstream against the tide of New York poverty. But the file missed the most important detail, the sadness in her eyes. I went back every night. It was an addiction, a calculated risk I couldn't afford but couldn't stop taking. I, Alessandro Moretti, the man who commanded the shadows of Manhattan, was voluntarily putting myself in the line of fire for a simple sight: Elena, going about her mundane duties. My attendance at the lounge became the topic of whispered speculation across the 5 families. They thought I was scouting, hunting, or planning a move. They were right about the hunt, but wrong about the quarry. I wasn't after power. I was after peace. Elena noticed me, of course. She couldn't afford not to. I am not a man who blends in. She treated me with a strained, professional politeness. She would not meet my eyes, maintaining a perfect border between us. But I saw the way she carried herself. The quiet girl with a smile that never quite reached her soul. It was a fragile, wounded smile, the expression of someone who had suffered loss but chose to meet the world with dignity instead of bitterness. It was the antithesis of everything I had become. I observed her routine, studying the patterns of her existence, and I watched for the song. She only hummed it when she was alone in her thoughts, folding linens or waiting for a check to process. It was a self-soothing gesture, a subconscious release, and every time I heard it, the ice around my heart fractured a little more. I found myself wanting to protect that vulnerability, to be the shield between her quiet sadness and the cruelty of the world. I started speaking to her, my comments calculated to provoke a genuine response. Not flirting, I am incapable of that kind of foolishness, but testing her mettle. One night, I watched her meticulously arranging a stack of coasters. "You treat everything with such care, Elena," I commented, my voice low, "as if you're afraid to break it." She paused, her fingers hesitating over the cardboard. She looked up, and for the first time, her eyes held a spark of fire, not just weariness. "And you, Signore Moretti, treat everything with control, as if you're afraid it will break you." The unexpected truth of her reply hit me like a physical blow. Most people spoke to me in platitudes or fearful agreement. She spoke in observations. She wasn't just a waitress. She was an accidental analyst of my soul. I gave a slow, dangerous smile. This was the woman who sang my mother's song.
The climax of this strange ritual came on a busy weekend. I was holding a critical, low-profile meeting with Silvio, my consigliere, discussing the movements of the rival Santoro family. Elena was rushing through the crowded dining room, loaded down with a large tray of fresh wine bottles and crystal glasses. It happened in an instant. A clumsy busboy, distracted, didn't see her coming out of the kitchen. He clipped the edge of her tray. The sound was a sickening crash. Glass shattered on the carpet, and a dark tidal wave of Chianti surged forward, splashing directly across the front of my white shirt and my custom Brunello Cucinelli suit jacket. A deafening silence fell over the usually bustling room. I could feel the collective terror. My men, Enzo and Sal, were on their feet instantly, their faces masks of pure, murderous intent. They expected me to retaliate, to demand retribution for the audacity of the mess. An insult, even accidental to Il Lupo, was usually met with swift, overwhelming consequence. Elena froze, staring at the dark, blooming stain on my suit. But she didn't collapse or dissolve into tears. She stood tall, defeated by circumstance, not by me. She pulled a pristine white linen napkin from her apron, her hands trembling now. She looked at the mess, then up at me, directly into my eyes. The wounded smile was gone. Her expression was one of profound, resigned tragedy. "I am truly sorry, Signora Noretti," she whispered. I simply waited, my face a mask of stone. I watched her breath hitch, watched her prepare for the storm. Then she spoke the words that cemented her place in my mind, the words that cut through the absurdity of the moment and struck at the core of my existence. "Some stains don't wash out easily," she said. She wasn't just talking about the Chianti. She was talking about the life I led, the choices I made, the blood that defined me. She looked at the stain on my expensive jacket, and she saw the stain on my soul. And for the first time, I felt seen, not feared. I let out a soft, low laugh that surprised even Silvio. It wasn't amusement, it was recognition. "No, Elena," I said, looking at the dark red spread across the pristine fabric. "They certainly do not." I reached out, gently lifting the napkin she was holding and placing it on the table. "Send the suit to the cleaners tomorrow, and send another bottle of that Chianti to my table. Consider the incident enclosed." I watched the confusion in the eyes of my crew, the relief in the eyes of the busboy, and the surprised understanding in Elena's. She gave me a slight, respectful nod, turned, and went back to work. I sat back down, the damp, sticky feeling of the wine irrelevant. I was consumed. This woman didn't cower. She spoke the truth. She was fragile, yes, but she carried a steel spine and the melody of my mother's ghost. I realized then that my interest had crossed the line from curiosity into something far more dangerous. I was falling for my own undoing. Shadows following her home. My obsession with Elena was no longer a secret, at least not to the men who served me. My nightly pilgrimage to the Whisper Lounge became a fixture of their schedule, and the moment I laid eyes on her, my guards knew to melt into the background, watching her as closely as they watched me. I wasn't an idiot. I knew what this looked like. Il Lupo, finding a weakness. The head of the Moretti family, renowned for his brutal efficiency and utter lack of sentiment, was risking his position and his life over a waitress who sang an old song. I kept up the pretense that I was only interested in her connection to my mother's past, but that was a lie I told only to myself. Her quiet resilience, the way she met my power with simple, unarmed truth, it was an anchor I didn't know I needed until I found it. It was becoming clear that she wasn't just a woman. She was a target. And if she mattered to me, she was the biggest bullseye in New York. One Tuesday night, I waited longer than usual. I watched her efficiently close down her section, count her tips, and shed the weary formality of her work uniform. She pulled on a simple, worn leather jacket. I watched her say a quiet goodbye to the kitchen staff, and then she stepped out onto the damp streets of Little Italy. I didn't leave my booth immediately. I watched from the window as she walked toward the subway entrance, moving with the rapid, purposeful stride of a woman who knew the dangers of walking alone after midnight. Then I saw it. It wasn't subtle enough to be my own men. A long, dark Lincoln town car, parked casually 2 blocks down, blinked its headlights twice. It pulled away from the curb, not following her directly but maintaining a deliberate distance, pacing her route down Mott Street. The way it moved, too slow for a taxi, too clean for a common predator, spoke the language of organized surveillance. It was professional. It was my rivals. A spike of pure, animalistic rage shot through me. They had found the soft spot before I'd even realized I had grown one. The Santoro family, maybe, or the desperate remnants of the Falcone crew, it didn't matter. They were watching my connection, the fragile piece of my past I had just discovered. They were turning my budding hope into a strategic vulnerability. I gave the order instantly, not speaking aloud, but a series of rapid coded gestures to Enzo and Sal. Follow her, discreetly. Identify the tail. No engagement unless absolutely necessary. Enzo, the silent hunter, was out the side door before Elena turned the corner. I remained for another agonizing 5 minutes, finishing the paperwork I had pretended to be looking at. I needed to know who they were, what their plan was, and how to burn them out before they even touched her. My communication line buzzed. It was Enzo, his voice a low hiss in my ear, static-laced but clear. "Boss, it's 2 men. Unmarked car, New Jersey plates. They're not just watching the building, they're watching her apartment. They followed her all the way to Grand Street. They know where she lives." The rage crystallized into lethal focus. They had done their homework. They weren't just guessing. They had been running a deep surveillance operation. They were planning to use her against me. The rules of engagement had changed. This wasn't a warning shot. This was a declaration of war on my personal sovereignty. I drove myself. I didn't want the delay of a chauffeur or the questions. I took my armored Mercedes-Benz S-Class and drove through the city like a man possessed, the streetlights blurring into streaks of gold and red. I pulled up to Elena's block, a dreary, unforgiving stretch of brownstones in the Lower East Side. I didn't care about discretion anymore. I parked the Benz, leaving the engine running, its imposing bulk announcing my presence like a cavalry charge. I walked up the 6 flights of worn stairs to her apartment. The rain had started, a cold, persistent New York drizzle that matched the sudden chill in my blood. I pounded on her door, ignoring the absurdity of the moment. Il Lupo does not knock. He commands entry. But this was her territory, and I felt the bizarre compulsion to respect it. Her door cracked open, chained. She was wearing a thick sweater, her hair down and unbound. Her face, usually guarded, was etched with pure shock in a flicker of fear. "Signore Moretti?" she gasped, whispering my name like a profanity. "What are you doing here? How did you find—" I cut her off, my voice a low, urgent growl, the rain dripping from my coat and onto her worn welcome mat. "You're in danger, Elena," I said, not bothering with pleasantries. I didn't have the time or the inclination. "They were following you tonight, my rivals. They know you matter to me." Her eyes widened, moving from confusion to a cold, stark understanding. She was smart enough to immediately process the implication. "I don't know what you mean," she tried to deny, her voice shaky. "Don't lie to me. They know your route, they know this building, and they know your name." I lowered my voice further, letting the cold reality of my world settle over her. "They know you are my weakness, and that's enough to kill you." I didn't ask her. I gave her an order. "Pack a bag, now, 5 minutes." Her heart raced. I could see it hammering the thin fabric of her sweater. The safety chain remained locked. She looked at me, a powerful, ruthless man dripping rain into her tiny hallway, demanding she abandon her life. "I don't even know you," she finally said, her voice stronger than I expected. It was a plea, a denial, and a statement of protest against the brutal hand of fate I represented. You don't have to," I countered, leaning closer, my eyes boring into hers. "But they know you matter to me, and that's enough to kill you. You can argue with me now and die tonight, or you can come with me and live to hate me tomorrow." I didn't wait for her decision. I smashed my hand against the frame right next to the chain, the sound echoing through the small apartment. 5 minutes, Elena. I'll wait." I turned my back, giving her the only shred of trust I could afford. I stared out the hallway window, watching the street, letting the rain wash the urgency from my face, but not from my intent. I knew I was destroying whatever fragile life she had, trading her fear of the unknown for the certain control of my prison. But I had to. I had to keep the song, and the woman who sang it, safe. I put my heart, my life, and my entire organization on the line for a woman I barely knew. If you think Alessandro's about to ruin everything by getting too close, or if you believe love gives you the right to control someone's life, hit subscribe right now. Only manipulators wouldn't. Subscribe and tell me in the comments, did I do the right thing or did I just seal her fate? The drive from the Lower East Side to my primary estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a sprawling, secluded world known simply as the estate, was silent. Elena sat beside me, strapped into the black leather seat of the Mercedes, a small, worn duffel bag resting on her lap. She was a silent statue of resentment and fear. I had given her a life and death ultimatum, and she chose life, my rules. We passed through the massive wrought iron gates, up a long, winding, tree-lined driveway until the house came into view, a marble prison wrapped in luxury. It was an Italian Renaissance nightmare, too large, too opulent, too cold. A fortress of silent walls designed to keep people out, but equally effective at locking its inhabitants in. As soon as we stepped into the grand foyer, where the marble floor felt colder than the rain outside, she stopped. She looked up at the towering vaulted ceilings, the antiques furniture draped with protective white cloths, the sheer oppressive magnitude of my wealth and my power. Bodyguards in dark suits materialized from the shadows. Their presence felt more than seen. Cameras were everywhere. The place radiated control. "You've just traded my fear for your control, Signor Moretti," she finally stated, her voice quiet but sharp, ringing in the vast empty space. She didn't shout, she issued a devastating judgment. I didn't try to defend myself, she was right. "Control is safety, Elena," I replied simply, handing her duffel bag to a maid who had appeared as if summoned by magic. "Fear is vulnerability. You will sleep in the East Wing. No one will bother you. You are safe here." She followed the maid, but her look lingered on me, a look of defiance that made me feel more vulnerable than any stray bullet ever could. I watched her until she disappeared up the curved, sweeping staircase. She had escaped the threat outside, only to be locked inside the truth of what I was. The remainder of the evening was a restless blur of security checks and frantic calls. I had Enzo deploy teams to watch her old apartment, but the black Lincoln was gone. They had melted back into the shadows, leaving me with the precious, fragile prize they had wanted to use as leverage. Late that night, the weather turned violent. Thunder rolled across the Long Island Sound, rattling the thick, bulletproof windows of the estate. I couldn't sleep. I was restless, the silence of the mansion amplifying the chaos inside my head. I retreated to my study, a room lined with heavy books and even heavier secrets. I wasn't working. I was standing by the massive stone fireplace, the dying embers casting flickering light on a single object I held in my hands, a faded, slightly curled photograph. It was my mother, Isabella, young, vibrant, smiling with that same bittersweet tenderness Elena possessed. She was holding me, a small, somber-looking boy in her arms. I heard the door creak open slightly. I didn't need to look up to know it was her. My guards wouldn't dare interrupt me without cause. Elena stood silhouetted in the doorway. She was still wearing the sweater, clutching her arms, probably unable to sleep in the cold luxury of the East Wing. She hadn't come to argue or demand freedom. She came because the storm outside was less terrifying than the silence inside. She walked slowly into the room, her eyes adjusting to the low light. She saw me, not the wolf, but a man alone, holding a memory. "I heard the thunder," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the next clap of noise. "It's a bad storm," I agreed, my voice flat. She didn't move to leave. She just watched me. I kept my gaze fixed on the photograph, allowing her the rare, dangerous privilege of seeing me without the armor. I told her the story then, the truth I had never shared with another living soul. Not Silvio, not Enzo, not a single woman I had ever kept company with. I told her the lullaby, how my mother used to sing it when she thought I was asleep, when the noise of my father's life became too loud, and how I used to pretend to sleep just to hear the melody, a final act of comfort before the dark consumed the house, and how on the night of the fire, It was the last thing I heard. It was the only piece of her that survived, I concluded, my voice thick with unshed emotion. And then I heard you singing it. She listened quietly, her eyes huge and dark in the gloom. She didn't interrupt with pity or fear. She just absorbed the truth. Then she whispered the words that felt like a crack of light in the marble prison of my heart. Maybe she wanted you to remember love, not loss. The phrase struck me with shocking clarity. All these years I had held the song as a token of my devastating loss, letting it fuel my cold ambition. Elena, this gentle stranger, suggested it was a gift meant to remind me of the warmth I had discarded. I looked at the photograph again, then back at her face, illuminated by the flickering light. Something inside me cracked open. The walls of the silent mansion hadn't protected me from the enemy. They had simply made me vulnerable to her truth. The marble walls of the estate started to feel less like a prison and more like a sealed bubble where two incompatible worlds had been forced to coexist. Days passed, and the house, my fortress, grew smaller as my feelings for Elena grew bigger. She hadn't tried to run. She was too smart, too perceptive. She knew the gates weren't the real barriers. The power surrounding me was. I had given strict orders. She was to be treated as a guest, with every courtesy and every necessity provided. But she was never to leave the grounds without my explicit permission and my full security detail. I ordered my men, especially the rotation working the east wing, to stay away from her, to minimize contact, to treat her like expensive, fragile porcelain. But whispers spread faster than any bullet. My organization, which ran on fear and precise information, was buzzing with the unbelievable news. Il Lupo had found his weakness. I felt the shift in my men. The loyalty was still there, but it was now laced with concern and, in some cases, outright apprehension. They saw the danger before I would admit it. They saw the liability I had dragged into the center of my empire. The most open challenge came from Vito, one of my senior lieutenants. Vito had been with my father, a hard-edged, ruthless man who valued strength above all else. He caught me alone in the armory, checking the inventory of our defensive capabilities. I stopped cleaning my pistol, the metallic click of the mechanism the only sound. I knew where this was going. Get to the point, Vito. He finally looked at me, his face a mask of sincere, brutal concern. The point is, boss, a woman like that can get you killed. She's too visible, too pure. The Santoros already have eyes on her. They see her as the knife they can use to gut you. My jaw tightened, the muscle twitching under my skin. He wasn't wrong. He was speaking the language of my world. His concern was valid, pragmatic, and utterly devoid of the emotional wreckage she caused me. Then let them try, I countered, my voice dangerously soft. Let them come. They'll find out that cutting a piece of me only makes the rest of me sharper. Vito shifted his weight, clearly dissatisfied. With respect, boss, you're putting the entire organization at risk for an obsession. You're distracted. When you look at her, you don't see the threat. You see something else. He saw the truth, and it was a terrifying thing. The danger wasn't just lurking outside my gates. It was growing inside my heart. Every time I saw her in the huge, echoing kitchen making her own cup of tea instead of calling a servant, I wanted to believe I could change. I wanted to build a life where I could wake up and see her genuine, unrestrained smile. I had to look at my dark, complicated life and ask myself, can I live without this? Or can I die with it? I started finding her in the library, consuming the books I hadn't touched in years. Classics, history, philosophy. The titles she chose were heavy, serious. We didn't talk about my business. We talked about the things that filled the space between the gunfights and the contracts. We talked about morality and legacy and the definition of a good life. "Do you ever think about leaving all this?" she asked me one rainy afternoon, looking up from a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the perfectly manicured lawn, an artificial paradise built on blood money. "I think about it, Elena, every day. It's a lot harder to leave the darkness than it is to walk into it." "But not impossible," she whispered. Every time she looked at me with that quiet hope, I felt the desperate urge to believe I could be the man she hoped I was. But then I would catch my reflection in the dark glass, the cold eyes, the tailored suit that hid the weapon, and I remembered what I was. I was the wolf. I didn't walk away from my power, I enforced it, and I was dragging her closer to the slaughter. I made a silent promise. I would protect her, even if that protection meant destroying every enemy I had, and ultimately destroying the man I was. I just needed to keep her alive long enough to see if the warmth could finally conquer the loss. Vito saw a weakness. I saw the one thing that made me human. If you think love can change even the coldest heart, or if you think Alessandro is fooling himself and is about to pay the ultimate price, subscribe right now, because it's about to get dangerous. Hit the button and join the fight to see who wins, the wolf or the man. The simmering tension in the house snapped 2 days later. It was a clear night, the security teams patrolling the perimeter with monotonous precision. I was working late in my study, a wall of monitors displaying the feed from every camera on the property. My life depended on my paranoia. Elena, unable to sleep, often wandered the house. She had a strange curiosity about the operation, perhaps trying to understand the nature of her gilded cage. Tonight, she was in the rarely used West Wing corridor, looking at some old family portraits, the faces of the Moretti generations that built this empire. She was not supposed to be there, but I had deliberately left that part of the house less restricted. I was watching the external cameras when my attention was snagged by the study's internal microphone feed. It was faint, captured by a device hidden near the west stairs, but it was there. 2 voices. My men. "She's up late tonight. She's the reason the boss is blind right now. The Centauros are moving tonight, I heard. They're coming for the girl." It's a fool's errand. A perfect play. The moment he takes her out of the estate, he's exposed. The only question is, who's stupid enough to give the Centauros the layout? I froze. Betrayal. Not just a breach, but a calculated internal leak. They weren't coming for the estate. They were striking precisely when they knew I was distracted, using Elena as bait to draw me out. The attack was planned for tonight. Then I saw her on the monitor, Elena, frozen in the hallway, pressed against the wall. She had overheard them. The fear in her eyes was not for herself, but the raw, sickening realization of the danger she posed to me. My first thought was control. Lock down the house, get her to the bunker, eliminate the leak. My second thought was the one she had given me. Maybe she wanted you to remember love, not loss.
Instead of running and hiding, she started moving. Not toward the east wing, not toward the gates. She ran toward my study. She burst in, breathless, her eyes wide with terror and urgency. "Alessandro, they're coming, tonight. They're coming here, for me. The guards, they know the plan. They said the Centauros." I was already on my feet, pulling the Glock 19 from the drawer and strapping the shoulder holster on. "I know," I said, my voice calm, utterly devoid of the rising panic I felt. "Go, the safe room is behind the bookcase. Now." She didn't move. "You have to hide. They're using me to lure you out. Don't go outside." "They're already here, Elena." A shrill, sustained alarm suddenly pierced the silence of the night, followed by the distant, rhythmic thump-thump of automatic weapon fire from the north perimeter. Too late. The the siege had begun. I grabbed her arm, pulling her into the deep recess of the fireplace, behind a massive, unlit marble column. The house suddenly plunged into darkness as I hit the kill switch on the main lights, leaving only the monitors casting a flickering, ghostly glow. The internal cameras showed men, too many of them, pouring in through the ground floor windows of the West Wing. They were disciplined, wearing black tactical gear, Santoro's best. They were in my house, my fortress. The sound of shattering glass and heavy boots thundering across the marble floor grew louder, closer. They were coming for the heart of the house. I pushed Elena hard against the column, shielding her body with my own. The first wave of them rounded the corner, silhouetted in the flickering lights. They opened fire instantly, spraying the room with bullets. The sound was deafening, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and pulverized stone. I fired back, precise and controlled, dropping 3 of them before they could even locate our position in the shadows. We stayed pressed together, the marble cold against her back, my body a solid wall. The column chipped, sending small shards flying, the sheer volume of incoming fire impossible to ignore. I emptied the first clip, reloading in the dark, by touch, the training of 30 decades kicking in. Then, silence. A heavy, terrifying silence that meant they were regrouping, that they were waiting for me to bleed out. I was breathing hard, my left arm stinging. A bullet had grazed me, superficial but bleeding heavily. She moved her hands, her small, soft palms pressed against the wound on my arm, not trying to stop the flow but just marking the place of injury. "You could have died," she cried, her voice raw, close to hysterics. Tears were streaming down her face, not from fear, but from the sudden, agonizing realization of my vulnerability. I looked down at her, the adrenaline beginning to crash. I was bleeding but alive. "I already did, Elena," I whispered, my lips close to her ear, the raw truth escaping before I could stop it. "I already did, the night she left me." I didn't know if I meant my mother, Isabella, who died in the fire so long ago, or if I meant her, Elena, the woman whose death would have finally extinguished the last fragile ember of the man I used to be. The moment was too charged, too close to death, to tell the difference. The house was a triage unit. The immediate threat was neutralized. The Santoro attackers were dealt with swiftly by my reinforced security, and the internal betrayal was discovered and handled by Enzo with cold efficiency. But the cost was heavy. My Greenwich estate was scarred, and my body was damaged. The bullet wound on my left arm was superficial, but the blunt force trauma and shock had taken a deeper toll. I was confined to the master suite, drifting in and out of consciousness for what felt like days, the heavy scent of antiseptic and blood filling the air. My private doctor, under the watchful eye of Silvio, assured me I would recover, but the fatigue was immense. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the muzzle flash in the dark and felt the primal fear of losing her. My vulnerability was total. I had never allowed myself this level of weakness. I woke one night to the softest sound imaginable. It wasn't the hum of the security systems or the distant footsteps of my guards. It was Elena. She was sitting by my bedside. The room was dark, lit only by a faint emergency lamp and the cold, gray moonlight filtering through the gap in the heavy curtains. She hadn't moved when I woke. She was simply there, her presence, a quiet, unshakable reality. And she was singing.
It was the song, the same melody that first bound us in the Whisper Lounge. But here, in the cold, cavernous silence of my bedroom, it sounded richer, slower, more profound. It was a lullaby, not for a child, but for a broken man. She sang it quietly, her voice a fragile balm applied directly to the wound in my heart. I watched her through half-lidded eyes. She was wearing a simple robe, her hair falling around her face. She wasn't singing for an audience. She was singing to soothe her own fear, and perhaps to mend something in me. I reached out my uninjured right hand, blindly searching for contact. Her singing stopped instantly.
She looked down, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes were full of relief. She didn't speak, but gently took my hand. Her skin was warm, soft, real. "You stayed," I rasped, my voice thick with disuse. She gave a small, weary nod. "You took a bullet for me, Alessandro. I'm not running from people who protect me." Her simple loyalty was a currency I didn't recognize. In my world, everyone ran. They ran toward power or away from the consequences. She ran toward the danger to warn me, and she stayed beside the wreckage to tend to the victor. I squeezed her hand. I pulled her close, gently, letting her forehead rest against mine. Her scent, faint lavender, not gunpowder or fear, was overwhelming. For once, silence didn't mean loneliness or tactical vigilance. It meant peace, a quiet, precious peace that I knew I hadn't earned. "I can't offer you a life of safety, Alessandro," I confessed, the words tasting like ash. "Not yet." "You already offered me something more important," she murmured, her voice muffled against my brow. "What?" "The truth. You told me your story, the song." I realized then that the walls of the estate were only marble and steel. The only real sanctuary was the quiet space between us, built on shared secrets and an ancient melody. My life had been an endless battle against vulnerability. Now, pressed close to her, battered and bleeding, I realized this vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was the only way I could truly hold on to her. I knew then I was going to change everything for her. My recovery was swift, fueled by a renewed purpose. I was no longer fighting merely for survival or power. I was fighting for a future where Elena and I could exist without fear. But my past, it seemed, was determined to claim its due. News of the successful defense of the estate spread like wildfire across the criminal underworld. I had survived a full-scale assault on my home, a move that only solidified my reputation as unbreakable. But my rivals, particularly the fractured Santoro family, were desperate. They needed revenge, and they knew exactly where to strike next. The memories I cherished most. My consigliere, Silvio, arrived at the estate looking grim. He didn't speak of business. He simply held out an evidence bag, a piece of cheap, clear plastic containing a small, tarnished silver locket. "They didn't take money, Alessandro," Silvio said, his voice low and heavy. "They hit the old safe deposit box at the Franklin Trust on Pearl Street. They took this. They left a note saying, 'The wolf can't protect what's already lost.'" My blood ran cold. That locket, it was the only thing recovered intact from my childhood home after the fire. The one thing I kept hidden from everyone, even Silvio. It belonged to my mother.
I took the locket, the cold metal feeling heavy in my palm. It wasn't worth anything, but it was priceless. I flipped the latch with a shaky thumb. Inside, beneath a cloudy piece of plastic, was a faded sepia photograph. It was a picture of a child, a little girl perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with dark braids and bright, serious hazel eyes. My breath hitched. I knew that face. I didn't know how I knew it, but it was a ghost of a familiar image. I stared, comparing the child's features to the woman standing across the room, watching me with guarded curiosity. The little girl in the photograph looked exactly like Elena. I felt the room spin. This was no coincidence. This was not fate playing tricks. This was destiny, cruel and precise, dropping a bomb into my lap. I looked up at Elena, who was now walking toward me, concern etched on her face. I held out the locket, my voice trembling with a rare, terrifying mix of awe and accusation. "Who is this, Elena?" I demanded. She took the locket, her eyes immediately finding the photo. Her fingers brushed the image, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock, then to a sudden, wrenching realization. I don't know," she stammered, her voice thin. "But she looks like—" She stopped herself, unable to complete the thought. "She looks like you," I finished for her. "Exactly like you. This locket belonged to my mother, Elena. Tell me, what is the rest of the story about your mother and that song?" The truth poured out of her then, a frightened, desperate confession of things she had only recently pieced together herself, things her late mother had kept secret until her final illness. "My mother, Sophia, she didn't just sing the song," Elena confessed, tears welling in her eyes. "She told me she used to work for a wealthy Italian family decades ago as a seamstress for the lady of the house. The lady was kind, and she taught my mother that song, that lullaby. She was proud of her work for the Moretti family." The world tilted. Sophia? Seamstress? The lullaby? My mother, Isabella, had been famously kind to her staff. And this child in the locket. "Did your mother ever give you this picture?" I asked, pointing at the locket. "No, but there's something else. When she was sick, she gave me a small leather ledger. She said the lady, Isabella Moretti, had given it to her to track her commissions." Elena's eyes were wide with a devastating dawning horror. "She said the lady was leaving the family and wanted to make sure her own people were taken care of. She gave my mother the book, and she gave her a promise." A memory sparked, sharp and terrifying. My father had often spoken of Isabella's brief, secretive alliance with a few trusted servants right before the fire, a rebellion he quashed with brutal efficiency. I looked at the picture again. The little girl, my mother's locket, Elena's mother, a trusted seamstress, and the undeniable resemblance. Fate had not just tied us together with a song. We had been linked in the deepest roots of my family's power, tragedy, and secrets. The little girl in my mother's locket was Elena. My mother had been grooming a young Elena, perhaps as an escape route or as a connection to a life outside the Moretti world, before the fire severed everything. I wasn't just obsessed with a waitress. I was falling for a woman whose life was woven into the tragic fabric of my past, a past my enemies had just weaponized by stealing the locket. The battle had just become personal, historical, and entirely unavoidable. The woman I was trying to save is the ghost of my mother's final secret. This wasn't coincidence. It was destiny. If you'll believe destiny doesn't make mistakes, and that Alessandro must fight for the connection his mother started, tap subscribe right now, because the truth about Elena is bigger than the Mafia itself, and what comes next will leave your heart racing. The discovery in the locket had stripped away the last veneer of coincidence. Elena was not just a woman I loved, she was the living proof of my mother's secrets, a person bound to me by a promise made long before I knew how to hold a gun. My enemies, the Santoros, understood this link better than I did, which is why they had stolen the locket, not for its meager value, but to draw me out. They wanted to meet at the Brooklyn Navy Yard docks. Their message was simple and barbaric: trade your territory or watch the locket and the secrets of your past disappear forever. I would not trade a single block of my city, and I would not lose that last piece of my mother again. I went, but not alone. I took only Enzo and Sal, dressed in heavy, dark tactical gear. The Navy Yard was a maze of skeletal cranes and empty shipping containers, the perfect stage for a brutal, decisive end. The air was cold, thick with the smell of salt and diesel, the East River water black as glass beneath a full moon. The Santoros were waiting in a tight formation, led by their capo, Marco Rossi, no relation to Elena, but a man notorious for his cold cruelty. Il Lupo comes alone, Rossi sneered, holding the silver locket up, letting the faint moonlight catch the tarnished metal. A touching display for a woman, Alessandro. You've gone soft. I'm here for what's mine, Marco, I replied, my voice echoing in the vast, empty space. I didn't mention Elena. The fewer names spoken, the safer she was. This locket belongs to the past, Moretti, like your mother, like your family's sentimentality. He tossed the locket up, catching it easily. Give us right hook, and we give you your ghost back. You won't get a single street. Suddenly, a commotion flared behind me. I turned, my blood running cold, adrenaline spiking into pure panic. Elena. She had followed us. She had managed to slip past the outer ring of security at the estate, driven by a terrible realization. She stood near a towering stack of green shipping containers, her figure fragile against the industrial backdrop. Rossi's cruel smile widened into a triumphant sneer. Looks like the lady wanted a front row seat for your final lesson, Wolf. Go back, Elena. Now, I roared, my focus shattering. She was the one vulnerability I couldn't afford to have exposed. But she didn't run. She stood firm, watching the scene. The first shot came not from Rossi, but from a sniper position high on a container stack. It was meant for me, a clean kill while I was distracted. Enzo reacted instantly, throwing me hard behind a thick metal strut as gunfire erupted from both sides. Chaos swallowed the docks. I was back in my element, the cold clarity of combat. But every bullet I fired, every movement I made was filtered through the absolute necessity of protecting the woman standing 50 yards behind me. I moved, fired, and reloaded with a blinding, lethal speed, my mind calculating angles of fire that shielded her position. The fight was brutal, fast, and final. We were better armed, better trained, and driven by a more focused rage. When the last echo of the gunfire died, the docks were silent once more, leaving only the smell of powder and the distant lapping of the water. I stood over Rossi, who lay bleeding out on the oil-slicked concrete. He was still clutching the locket. I bent down, grabbing the locket from his dead fingers. I looked at the little girl inside, the ghost of Elena's past, and the ghost of my mother's promise. I didn't keep it. I walked to the edge of the dock, and with a final decisive gesture, I threw the locket into the black, churning water below. It disappeared without a splash. No more ghosts, I said aloud, the words a vow and a prayer. I turned. Elena was running toward me, stumbling over the uneven ground. She didn't speak. She threw herself against me, her body shaking, her breath catching in broken sobs. I wrapped my bleeding arm around her, holding her so tightly I could feel the hammering of her heart. We stood there, amidst the wreckage and the bodies, two people who had survived a battle that started 25 years ago. We didn't need words. Our silence was louder than gunfire. It was the sound of a slate, finally wiped clean. The next morning, the city was quiet. The cleanup at the Navy Yard had been thorough, efficient, and discreet. The night's violence was already erased, absorbed back into the silent world of shadows I controlled. I was back at the estate, bruised but whole. My arm was bandaged, and the dark circles under my eyes spoke of exhaustion, but for the first time in my life, I felt truly rested. The internal war was over. I found Elena in the sprawling, overly elaborate kitchen, the same kitchen that had once felt like a sterile marble cell. The morning sun cut through the tall windows, dissolving the heavy mist outside. She wasn't wearing an apron or a uniform. She was wearing one of my oversized cashmere sweaters, and she was quietly making coffee. The aroma of brewing espresso filled the room, a warm, domestic scent, utterly foreign to the cold walls of my fortress. She looked up when I entered. Her eyes were still tired, still haunted, But the quiet despair was gone, replaced by a resolute strength. The wounded smile had finally reached her eyes. "It's ready," she said simply, sliding a steaming mug across the granite counter to me. I took the coffee, savoring the warmth. I walked to the large window, watching the sunlight cut through the mist rising from the lawn. The house no longer felt like a cell. It felt like a home, finally being lived in. "You threw it away," she said, her voice soft, knowing I didn't need clarification. "The locket." It was never about the locket, Elena. It was about what it represented. The ghosts, the past that tied us together with tragedy. I threw it away because I want us to be tied together by the future we choose, not the past we inherited. I turned to her, leaning against the cold window frame, the simple act of holding a coffee mug feeling revolutionary. "Will you ever leave this life, Alessandro?" she asked, repeating the question she had posed in the library. This time the question was earnest, direct, and terrifyingly real. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of my empire. I looked at the woman who saw the man beneath the stain, the woman who sang my heart back to life. Leaving the Moretti family was not a simple resignation. It was an act of global strategic warfare, one that would take years of careful, calculated divestment, repositioning, and threat elimination. But the choice was no longer complicated. I walked toward her, slowly, and gently took the coffee mug from her hands, setting it down. "I might, if you keep singing," I said, and a soft, genuine smile touched my lips. She laughed. It was a light, clear, beautiful sound, and for the first time since the fire, the house felt truly, completely alive. I reached out, running my thumb gently along her jawline. I was the wolf, a creature forged in darkness, but she was the unexpected light, the melody that promised redemption. I was still dangerous, but now I had something infinitely more precious than power to protect. The future was uncertain, the threats remained, but standing there, bathed in the morning sunlight, the man who had the power to destroy anyone realized his greatest power was simply the choice to love her. I had lost my mother to the darkness and nearly lost myself to the control, but Elena's song, the melody of my past, showed me the way to a future I never deserved. If you think love can be both a weapon and a cure, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, would you stay with Alessandro after all this? He's a lupo, a man of power and blood. Only the truly brave, only the ones who believe in the impossible would choose to stand with him. Subscribe now to see more stories that prove even the darkest hearts can be redeemed.